your next worksheet, Mendelian Genetics worksheet, where you have quite a bunch of practices. So by the time you finish with this, you should be a pro. So let's look at our first cross, both homozygous dominant. There are no alternatives here. All of them are going to be homozygous dominant because there are no recessive alleles in this cross. That's what they call pure breeding. So both parents are of the same genotype. So 100% are going to be homozygous dominant. So dominant is going to be 100%, and recessive is going to be 0. The next one, you have homozygous dominant versus heterozygous. Homozygous, 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 both are dominant. And then we have heterozygous, and again a heterozygous. So homozygous dominant 50%, and heterozygous 50%, 0 for your homozygous recessive. So dominant is going to be, this is for phenotypes. Phenotypes meaning, for example, if we were talking about purple flowers, this would be purple, and that would be purple as well. Both of them are going to be dominant phenotype, not genotype, but phenotype. So even though the bottom part, they are heterozygous, they're still going to be purple because your dominant allele there is present. So in this case, the dominant phenotype is going to be 100%, recessive is going to be 0. And the last one, you have homozygous dominant versus homozygous recessive. All of your offsprings are going to be heterozygous, which means that they're all going to be, again, of the dominant phenotype. They're all going to be purple. So 100% for dominant phenotype, 0 for recessive phenotype, and it's going to be 100% for your heterozygous genotype. Cross with one heterozygous parent. So what they're talking about, one parent in all of these, at least one, is going to be heterozygous. So what are your options? Heterozygous with homozygous dominant, heterozygous with homozygous recessive, and then heterozygous, another heterozygous. So you know what's going to happen here. Both homozygous dominant and heterozygous here. As far as genotypes go, you will have 50-50. You will have 50% homozygous dominant and 50% heterozygous. Again, since at least one of your alleles is dominant, it's going to be 100% dominant phenotype. All your flowers are going to be purple, 0 flowers are going to be white. When we cross both heterozygous, we will have homozygous dominant, heterozygous, another heterozygous here, and we actually have one homozygous recessive. So as far as percentage for genotypes goes, this will be 25%, 2 heterozygous, that's a 50%, and then one homozygous recessive, that's again 25%. Now another way to write this could be 1, 2, 1. As far as dominant phenotype, we have 75% of them. These two together will give you 75. Recessive phenotype is only 25%. And finally, we have heterozygous crossed with homozygous recessive, heterozygous, heterozygous, and then homozygous recessive, homozygous recessive. 0 for this, then half, which is 50%, would be heterozygous, and another half, which is also 50% for homozygous recessive. Dominant phenotype in this case is going to be 50%, so half of the flowers are going to be purple and half of the flowers are going to be white. So it sort of makes sense because we had purple on white and it ended up to be 50-50, but only because this was recessive, not dominant. The next one is crossing with homozygous recessive parent. So again, at least one of them is homozygous recessive. In this case, we have both homozygous recessive. Now, let's cross them. So we have heterozygous, another heterozygous, heterozygous, and again heterozygous. So we had two parents that are opposite. We've seen this before. So then it's going to be 0 for that, 100% for heterozygous, and 0 for homozygous recessive. Dominant phenotype, 100%, and 0 for recessive. Then we are crossing a homozygous recessive with a heterozygous. Heterozygous here, heterozygous here, and then homozygous recessive for the lower part of the Punnett square. 0 for homozygous dominant, 50% heterozygous, and 50% homozygous recessive. Dominant phenotype, this one, so that's going to be 50%, and recessive is going to be again 50%. That's when we have both alleles recessive, which will be the lower part of your Punnett square. And the last one, well, since all of them are homozygous recessive, none of these, and 100% of your homozygous recessive. No dominant, because dominant, remember, was purple, and both of these flowers, both of the parents are white, and they do not carry a single capital A. So since it's not present, then it's not present. So recessive is going to be 100%. All right, and our last page. What crosses will result in all dominant phenotype offsprings? Well, think about this. All dominant phenotype. What are your options? It could be A, since we've been using A for this particular activity, or A and A. Well, if you go back and look at what we had, the cross of both parents who were homozygous dominant definitely will give you that answer. So which means that your possibility is the cross of both dominant, both parents are homozygous dominant. Then look at this. That also gives us dominant phenotype. All of your cases are going to be dominant phenotype. And then your last one is also both parents are homozygous, but one of them is dominant and the other one is recessive. So this type of crossing will also result in a dominant phenotype, because when you cross these, then you will have all of your 100%, the genotype is going to be recessive, which is a dominant phenotype. So you have three options. The next question, number 2, what cross will result in all recessive phenotype offspring? All recessive. There's only one option. If both your parents were homozygous recessive, that is the only possibility, because if there's at least one of these, then it's going to be a dominant phenotype. At least one dominant allele, and you end up with a dominant phenotype. So boom, we cannot allow a single dominant allele if we want to have our phenotype all recessive. The next one, what cross will result in a half dominant and half recessive phenotype? Which means that we can have AA or AA both dominant. So phenotypes are both dominant. This one is heterozygous, and this guy is homozygous dominant. And then half of our offsprings need to have recessive phenotype. So what we're looking at is 50-50. Well, let's go back. We had, these guys were 50-50. These were all hundreds. Here's a 50-50, and here's another 50-50, which technically is the same thing. We cross one homozygous recessive and the other one is heterozygous. AA crossed with a homozygous recessive. So that's our answer. What cross will result in a ratio of 3 dominant phenotype to 1 recessive? That means like 75% to 25%. So there you go. None of these. There you go. I see it here. I have dominant being 75% and 25% for recessive. 75% versus 25% if I have both parents heterozygous. So this would be heterozygous on heterozygous. So A on AA. 3-to-1, because what this happens to be is 3/4 to 1/4. So that's what they mean by 3-to-1. 75% to 25%. In question 5, you need to be paying attention. You always need to be paying attention. So far, in questions 1 to 4, they were always talking about phenotype, 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 and phenotype again. In question number 5, they're talking about genotype. Genotype needs to be 1-to-1, which means 25% would be homozygous dominant, 50% would be heterozygous, and then the remaining 25% is going to be homozygous recessive. Again, how do they come up with this 1-to-2-to-1? 25% is 1/4, 50% is 2/4, and again, 25% is 1/4. So that's your 1-to-2-to-1. So which cross would give us this? If you remember, I even wrote it that way, 1-to-2-to-1. So it's heterozygous on heterozygous. So here's your answer. Heterozygous on heterozygous. That will give you 1% of 25% to 50 to another 25. Question number 6. All homozygous recessive. Well, by now you should know it's going to be if you cross two parents, kind of what they call pure breeding. Both parents have the same genotype. So you have both homozygous recessive in order for the offsprings to be homozygous recessive. Only one possibility. Number 7, what cross will result in half homozygous dominant offspring and half heterozygous offspring? So we're talking about half homozygous dominant and half heterozygous. So what you need to notice that there are no homozygous recessive, which means we cannot cross heterozygous, because if we cross heterozygous, look at this. If I cross these two heterozygous, then there will be a combination of these two. So that is not going to help us. So I'm going to erase this part. And then how do I get half of these, exactly half of these, and exactly half of these? I need to have probably something like that. And maybe this, that would give me 1 and 2. And then this times this, and then that times that. So there you go. A heterozygous, right there, and then a homozygous dominant. They will give me half of homozygous dominant and half heterozygous. That's the only possibility. One parent has to be homozygous dominant and the other one should be heterozygous. Number 8, what cross will result in heterozygous offsprings? All of them, all of them. The only possibility is if I cross my parents who are opposite on the line. One parent should be homozygous dominant and one parent should be homozygous recessive. In that case, all your crosses are going to be heterozygous. Number 9. So what we have here is in dogs, black fur is dominant over yellow fur. B is your dominant and lower B is going to be yellow fur. A homozygous black dog, that's the genotype, is mated with a yellow dog. The only possibility for a dog to be yellow is this. These two dogs are crossed, do a Punnett square to show the cross and predict the offsprings. Well, it's going to be BB homozygous dominant on BB homozygous recessive. So hopefully you can predict that all of your little puppies are going to be heterozygous. If you cross a black lab, a pure black lab, dominant homozygous, with a yellow lab, which is also homozygous, all of your little puppies are going to be black. And then the last one, black fur is dominant, and you're taking heterozygous black and a yellow dog. Well, in this case, you are actually going to have a few yellow puppies. What's going to end up here? Heterozygous, right? So I will have 50% black puppies. And then this part, yellow puppies. So 50, 50, 50. Half of the puppies are going to be black, half of the puppies are going to be yellow. And that's it. Hopefully, my dear, this helps and you are getting better at Punnett squares and predicting what kind of genotypes and what kind of phenotypes you're going to end up when you cross different genotypes and phenotypes.